They said his death was natural, that the great Napoleon Bonaparte simply rotted away under the slow poison of time. But what if that was a lie wrapped in velvet, sealed by empires, and whispered across centuries so no one would ever question why one of the most powerful men in history died screaming in the dark, on an island built like a tomb? Picture this, a bloated corpse, ulcers split open, black bile spilling from his mouth, his flesh corroding before the body even went cold. The air thick with a stench that seeped into the walls. The British doctors wrote it down as stomach cancer. But what if that diagnosis was a disguise? What if the real cause of death wasn't biological, but political? Because here's what they won't teach you in history books: Napoleon didn't just lose battles, he became too dangerous to exist. The same British crown that once trembled before his armies couldn't allow him to die a hero. They needed him to rot in shame, to become a cautionary tale. And they chose a place that wasn't just exile, it was designed confinement. St. Helena, a volcanic rock at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by ocean and storms. A place where sound itself seemed to vanish. No escape. No allies. No witnesses. The world thought Napoleon was gone. But even in exile, his words, his letters, his dreams, they still moved the pulse of nations. So the question became, how do you kill a man whose mind still threatens the crown? In the shadows of St. Helena, a silent war began, not fought with armies, but with cups of wine, damp walls, and something unseen that slowly ate him alive from the inside. Witnesses spoke of his hair turning brittle, his eyes growing pale, and the smell of bitter almonds in his room, the signature of arsenic. But the truth runs deeper than poison. Because when you strip away the legends, what remains is this: Napoleon didn't die from illness. He was erased, one fragment of a much older pattern, the ancient ritual of the powerful devouring their own to maintain control. And you were never meant to know that. Now tell me, do you still believe empires fall by accident? Or do you feel it, that cold, invisible hand pulling the strings, deciding who gets remembered and who gets buried alive? Let's go deeper. You're not here for stories. You're here to remember what they wanted you to forget. They didn't send Napoleon to St. Helena to watch him die. They sent him there to erase his mind before his body followed. Think about it, this was not a prison. It was an experiment in control. Every inch of that volcanic island was designed to strip him of power, identity, and memory. The same man who had commanded half of Europe was now being studied like a specimen in a cage. His guards weren't soldiers, they were watchers. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, was no ordinary jailer. He was cold, methodical, obsessed with detail. He inspected Napoleon's letters, counted his meals, recorded his moods. Even the slightest flicker of defiance was noted in secret reports sent back to London. You see, St. Helena wasn't isolation, it was surveillance. Napoleon's every move, every conversation, every cough was documented and dissected by men trained in psychological warfare, long before that term even existed. The goal wasn't to execute him, but to erase his myth. They took his books, his correspondence, his uniform, even the mirrors from his room. Imagine that. The man who once crowned himself Emperor of France, forced to live without the reflection of his own face. That's not punishment. That's psychological disassembly. But something strange happened. The longer he was watched, the more they feared him. Because Napoleon didn't break. He began speaking of visions, of destiny, of shadows that guided kings, of forces older than empires. He told his few remaining followers that he wasn't truly defeated, that his exile was part of a greater design, a test orchestrated by powers that move behind governments and crowns. And maybe, he was right. Because letters later uncovered from the archives of the East India Company suggest that Napoleon's exile wasn't just Britain's decision. Hidden correspondence reveals the signatures of financiers, powerful banking families who profited from both his wars and his downfall. The same families who, decades later, would manipulate entire nations through debt and war. Napoleon had become a threat not because he conquered land, but because he had seen the architecture of control, the hidden machinery that decides who rules, who starves, and who dies in the name of order. St. Helena wasn't his prison. It was a containment field. And every whisper from his cell carried a secret those families feared might still reach the world. Now the question is, what secret did he die protecting? By the time his body began to swell and his skin turned a sickly yellow, Napoleon knew something was wrong, something beyond sickness, something being done to him. He started keeping a secret journal, hidden beneath the floorboards of Longwood House, where the damp air never dried and the lamps burned low. These weren't the writings of a dying man, they were warnings. Lines written in code. Phrases in Latin, Greek, and Corsican that described a fire inside the blood and the invisible salt that burns the spirit. The official story says his condition was gastric cancer. But the autopsy tells a stranger tale. His internal organs were almost liquefied. His hair, when tested centuries later, was laced with arsenic levels hundreds of times higher than normal. But what few mention is the pattern. The doses found weren't enough to kill instantly, they were enough to control the speed of his decay. Someone was calibrating his death. The wine he drank came in sealed bottles only his British attendants could open. The wallpaper in his room was dyed with Scheele's green, a pigment made with arsenic that releases poison when it meets damp air. Even the ink in his letters contained trace toxins. Imagine breathing, writing, eating, and slowly being consumed by every object around you. That's not disease. That's design. But Napoleon began to suspect it. His last notes mention the English shadow and the sickness that listens. He wrote of waking in the night to hear footsteps, not outside his room, but inside the walls. And then came the drawings. Strange sketches of eyes, spirals, and hands pulling invisible strings. To his doctors, they were signs of delirium. To historians today, they're proof of his mind trying to decode what was happening, a man realizing he was the subject of something far beyond human cruelty. Because here's the truth no one wants to touch, Napoleon wasn't just poisoned. He was studied as he died. The slow collapse of the most powerful will on earth became a laboratory experiment, to see how long it takes for dominance to turn into despair. And the results were buried with him. But a fragment survived, a torn page, discovered years later, that reads, "Power never dies. It only changes hands." Tell me, what did he mean by that? We're only halfway down this tunnel. If you can still hear me clearly, you're already part of the few who see through the veil. The autopsy was supposed to bring closure, but instead, it opened a door that history has spent 2 centuries trying to slam shut. May 6, 1821. The small bedroom of Longwood House was sealed. Only 7 men were allowed inside. The air was heavy, rank with rot and iron. Napoleon's body lay swollen, his face almost unrecognizable, except for the eyes. Those eyes, even dead, they seemed to watch. The British doctor, Francesco Antimarchi, made the first incision. What he found made him go silent. The lining of the stomach, black, blistered, and crumbling, looked burned. His liver was enlarged, his intestines laced with ulcers that seemed to have formed all at once. And then, something stranger still, traces of a greenish residue around the stomach walls, the same hue as Scheele's green, the arsenic pigment used on the wallpaper around him. Yet when the official report was sent to London, those details disappeared. The documents were rewritten, sealed, and stored in the Admiralty's confidential archives. And when copies were published later for the public, the descriptions had changed. Burns became lesions, green residue became inflammation. Words were altered, truth diluted. But the manipulation didn't stop with paper. After the autopsy, something unholy was done to the body. Napoleon's heart, the one he had asked to be sent to his son, was removed and never returned. His stomach was taken, preserved, and hidden. Years later, when his remains were supposedly repatriated to France, none of those organs were found in the coffin. So what happened to them? A report uncovered in 1961 from a private London collection revealed that samples of Napoleon's tissues were quietly transferred to a medical research division linked to the British Army, an early forerunner of today's classified biowarfare programs. The purpose? Observation of tissue degradation from prolonged chemical ingestion. You understand what that means, don't you? The Emperor of France was dissected not as a man, but as data. His death wasn't a tragedy, it was a test. And when his coffin was finally opened in Paris in 1840, witnesses described something impossible. Napoleon's body was perfectly preserved, as if time itself had stopped. No decay. No rot. His face still recognizable. Science calls it natural mummification. But deep down, we know better. When the powerful play with life and death, sometimes, death doesn't play back. When the coffin was opened in Paris and they saw that unrotted face, the same sharp jaw, the same faint curl of a smirk, something shifted in the room. Men who had served kings fell to their knees. The soldiers wept. The priests whispered prayers that weren't in any book. And then, the myth began to breathe again. Across France, secret gatherings began forming. They called themselves the Sons of the Eagle. A strange mixture of ex-soldiers, aristocrats, and scholars who believed Napoleon had transcended death, that he had become a vessel for something eternal. Some claimed his preservation was divine. Others, darker still, said it was proof of a pact. Because before his final campaign, Napoleon had been seen carrying a small black stone, carved with symbols no historian could trace. It disappeared after his capture. Years later, when British archives were unsealed, a description appeared in the margins of a confiscated inventory, an object of volcanic origin, emitting mild heat when held. They never found it again. But the societies that rose in the years after his death began using that same symbol, the coiled serpent, the rising sun, the single-eyed eagle, the exact sigil engraved on that stone. Coincidence? Or continuation? Here's the part they never told you: Napoleon's embalming ritual wasn't done by church officials. It was overseen by a physician known to have connections with the Royal Society of Natural Philosophy, an organization obsessed with the continuity of vital energy. They believed the human body, at the moment of death, could be sealed in a state between life and decay, a vessel that would not decompose because it had become a container for will itself. And maybe that's what they did to him. Because every empire since, from the banking dynasties of the 19th century to the political puppeteers of today, has used Napoleon's image as more than history. His likeness became a sigil of dominance, printed on currency, monuments, war medals, even propaganda. The world didn't bury him. It absorbed him. Maybe immortality isn't about living forever. Maybe it's about being used forever. And here's where I need you to pause. If you've followed this far, you're not just watching a story, you're stepping into the current of something ancient. To lock this in, to declare that you choose awareness over illusion, comment these words twice: I see through the empire. Do it. Seal it. Because from here on, it gets darker. After Napoleon's body was sealed beneath that black marble tomb in Les Invalides, something began to spread, not his bloodline, but his design. Every empire that came after him learned from his blueprint: control through image, obedience through illusion. Napoleon had once said, "A man does not govern by the sword, but by imagination." The elites listened. And they built an entire century upon that sentence. His strategies became silent scripture for the powerful. Modern governments studied his writings not for war, but for psychology. The way he rewrote history books to glorify himself? That became state propaganda. The way he staged grand ceremonies, choreographed applause, and weaponized symbols of power? That became the model for every political stage you've seen since. But it went deeper. Behind the scenes, a small circle of financiers, the same families who had watched him rise and funded his fall, began building institutions. Schools. Banks. Newspapers. They learned that power doesn't need armies if it owns the story. And the story they built out of Napoleon's ghost was simple: a world that worships the conqueror but never questions the system that creates him. Even his personal insignia, the bee, became a symbol of organized hierarchy. The queen, the drones, the workers. Efficiency. Obedience. No individuality. And today? That same model drives your economy, your politics, your attention. You call it productivity. He called it order. So when people say Napoleon was the last emperor of the old world, they're wrong. He was the prototype for the new one. His failure gave birth to systems that learned to conquer not land, but minds. And if you think that's just metaphor, look around you. Every election, every advertisement, every algorithm whispering what you should desire, that's the empire reborn. His methods distilled into digital warfare. You're not being ruled by kings anymore. You're being ruled by the same principles Napoleon mastered: attention, repetition, and controlled narrative. The modern world didn't outgrow him. It perfected him. Pause, low voice, maybe that's why his body didn't rot. Because the idea of him never died. It just put on 1,000 new faces. The day the coffin returned to France in 1840, crowds lined the Seine for miles. They called it the return of the emperor. But behind the flags, the hymns, and the tears, something else was happening: a transfer. The moment the coffin was lowered into Les Invalides, the ritual began. Beneath the public ceremony, a handful of men in dark coats stood apart. They weren't soldiers. They were members of a quiet alliance, a secret cabal later referenced in letters as l'Ordre de l'Aigle Noir, the Order of the Black Eagle. They weren't there to honor him. They were there to claim him. Napoleon's preserved body, they believed, was more than a corpse. It was a relic, a battery of willpower, a vessel of intent that could be harnessed. The embalming salts used on him weren't the ordinary mix of mercury and alcohol. They contained compounds found only in early alchemical manuscripts: salts of antimony and cinnabar, substances once used by mystics to bind the ether to matter. And here's where it turns from history to heresy. In the years following his reburial, several of those same men went on to found the early intelligence bureaus of Europe, precursors to MI6, the Duxim Bureau, and later, the OSS and CIA. They believed that control of information was control of destiny. The idea that knowledge is power wasn't a metaphor to them, it was a doctrine. And their guiding symbol, embossed on secret seals and correspondence? The single-headed eagle, identical to Napoleon's personal crest, minus the crown. Coincidence? Or inheritance? Because when you trace the lineage of those organizations, the private networks of influence, the covert banks funding both sides of every war, they all point back to the same blueprint: surveillance, manipulation, and myth. The same blueprint Napoleon saw, tried to seize, and was destroyed for understanding. And still, pieces of him remain scattered across vaults and collections: locks of hair, fragments of skin, samples of embalming fluid. Each held not as historical curiosities, but as symbols. A reminder to those who serve power that even an emperor can be reduced to property. The dark truth is this: the empire never ended. It simply changed its form, from armies to agencies, from crowns to contracts, from flags to frequencies. And the spirit of the conqueror now lives in the system itself. The eagle no longer needs wings to fly, it travels through data, through desire, through everything you think is yours. After the wars ended and the flags changed hands, the true conquest began, not of nations, but of narratives. Napoleon had already shown the formula: control the image, and you control the mind. He used paintings, medals, theater, even coins to make himself look larger than life. The same technique became the skeleton of every propaganda machine built after him. But what started as art evolved into something much more dangerous: psychological architecture. By the early 20th century, his ideas had merged with the science of the mind. A man named Gustave Le Bon studied Napoleon's writings on mass behavior and expanded them into what he called the crowd. He wrote that men in groups do not think, they feel. And those feelings can be manufactured. That one book became the secret weapon of politicians, advertisers, and intelligence agencies alike. From there, it spread. Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, weaponized those theories into modern public relations. His methods of emotional manipulation, fear conditioning, and engineered consent were directly inspired by the Napoleonic model of control through spectacle. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses, he wrote, is an important element in democratic society. Democratic. The perfect disguise. And now, 2 centuries later, the conquest has gone digital. The same strategies that once built empires through armies now move through algorithms. Social media isn't communication, it's conditioning. Every scroll, every click, every suggested post is the new battlefield. The same war Napoleon fought for hearts and minds, only now, you carry the empire in your pocket. Think about it. The notification that gives you a pulse of dopamine, the outrage that keeps you watching, the illusion that you're free because you can choose between identical options. It's the same empire, reborn in data. You are no longer a subject by force. You are a subject by design. Napoleon once said, "Men are moved by 2 levers only, fear and self-interest." 2 centuries later, that's all the algorithm needs to predict you. The same principles that controlled millions through the sound of cannons now control billions through silence, through invisible code. You were never meant to remember this connection. But now you do. When Napoleon's body was failing, and his mind drifted between fever and clarity, he began to write again, not speeches, not military notes, but prophecies. These fragments, scattered through his final letters, were long dismissed as the hallucinations of a dying man. But when decrypted, they form a pattern, a message encoded with deliberate symbols. One letter, dated April 1821, just weeks before his death, reads, "The eagle does not die. It sleeps beneath the smoke of the world, waiting for the time when men no longer fight with swords but with shadows." At first glance, it sounds poetic. But look deeper. Smoke of the world, industrialization. Fighting with shadows, information, deception, unseen war. He was describing a future he somehow sensed, a war not of territory, but of truth. Another fragment mentions the sons of glass and light, a phrase scholars now link to the first telegraph networks and later, communication cables. He wrote, "They will weave their webs across oceans, and the rulers of the new world will not wear crowns, but numbers." Numbers. Data. Codes. Was this foresight? Or was Napoleon passing on knowledge given to him, knowledge he wasn't supposed to possess? Because the more you study those final letters, the clearer it becomes. Napoleon believed he was part of something larger, an ancient current of power, older than monarchy, older than religion, that moves through civilization like an invisible empire. He called it l'ordre du silence. The order of silence. The hidden architects behind every rise and fall, every revolution that replaces one system of control with another. Not to destroy the empire, but to keep it alive by changing its face. And according to his final entry, the empire would return when men bow not to kings, but to glass mirrors that speak. Tell me, what do you hold in your hand right now? The prophecy wasn't metaphor. It was instruction. Napoleon understood that control would evolve, from monarchy to democracy, from democracy to data. He saw the loop before it began. He didn't die defeated. He died knowing the next empire was already being built, inside you. If you've followed this far, you've already crossed the threshold he warned about. And once seen, it can't be unseen. You've made it to the end, and that means something. Most never do. Because the truth isn't loud, it's quiet. It hides beneath comfort, convenience, and screens that hum like lullabies. But Napoleon, he saw this age before it began. He warned that one day, men would mistake illusion for liberty. They would trade thrones for devices, kings for algorithms, armies for influence. They would serve an empire without banners, because they would love their own servitude. Look around. You're not forced to obey. You're enticed to. You're rewarded for compliance, punished for silence, and distracted into obedience. The same architecture that once crowned emperors now crowns data. Every empire before this one demanded your labor. This one demands your attention. Napoleon's prophecy wasn't about himself. It was about you. He understood that power moves like a serpent, it sheds skin but never dies. Rome became monarchy. Monarchy became empire. Empire became market. And now the market has become mind. But listen carefully, because buried in his final coded phrase was a way out. He wrote, "The empire ends when the mirror cracks." That mirror is perception. The way you see power, the way you believe the system defines you. Once a man sees beyond that reflection, he is no longer ruled. Because awareness breaks the illusion, and the empire cannot rule what it cannot deceive. So this isn't just a story of a dead emperor. It's the story of every man who has ever felt that something invisible was shaping his life, every man who felt his will was being drained by forces he couldn't name. Now you can name them. The Watchers. The Silencers. The Architects of Obedience. The invisible crown that feeds on your focus. Voice drops lower, commanding, so here's what you do, stop feeding it. Withdraw your energy from what steals it. Build your own mind like an empire. Guard your time like a fortress. Rule yourself, completely. That is the rebellion they fear most. And if you feel that fire in your chest right now, that quiet pulse of defiance, then comment again, twice, "I see through the empire." That's not engagement. It's initiation. It's you stepping out of illusion and into awareness. Napoleon died on a rock in the middle of the sea. But his final whisper wasn't defeat, it was revelation. The empire ends when the mirror cracks. Now, look into the mirror, and watch what breaks first.